This is Far From Home. I'm Scott Goren. Before I started this show, I worked for many years as a reporter, editor, and producer in public radio, so I'm kind of a radio guy at heart. Because, I'll be honest, as much as I enjoyed making this podcast, there's nothing that comes even close to the thrill of turning on a microphone and broadcasting live. And you don't have to have worked in radio to get that feeling. Now that so much of our world is online and digital, this might sound foreign to some of you who happen to be younger, but if you ever tuned in an AM radio after dark, you may have noticed that you could sometimes pick up stations from hundreds of miles away, which I always thought was pretty cool. Or maybe you've heard a broadcast from the BBC where someone was reporting from a distant or obscure place on the other side of the world. I've been thinking about all this recently because COVID-19 has closed borders and made traveling difficult, if not impossible, for many of us over the past year and a half. But radio signals don't need passports or plane tickets. They circle the Earth, bouncing off the atmosphere. So even if you're confined to your home, it's possible, with a good antenna, to listen to voices from the other side of the planet. On today's show, I'm going to play a recent conversation I had with my friend and colleague David Goren, who's super passionate about this topic and has spent years monitoring the airwaves. We spoke a few weeks ago before a small crowd of Far From Home listeners and fans in Clubhouse, which is a new audio-based social media app you might have heard me talking about recently. And if you're interested, I'll give you some more details about that at the end of the episode. I began by asking David to introduce himself.
I'm a longtime radio listener from days as a kid in the 1960s. Even before I knew about shortwave, I listened to long-distance broadcasts on AM or medium wave, as it's known in other parts of the world. I'm a radio producer. I recently made several documentaries for the BBC and have a lot of interesting projects. I also make or have curated the Brooklyn Pirate Radio sound map. We'll talk about that a little later.
Right. And if any of you ever go to David's house in Brooklyn, he has this amazing collection of antique radios on shelves all around his dining room. How many do you have, David?
Probably, 50, 60, 70.
It's really impressive and super cool. You actually inspired me to start a small collection of my own. Anyway, the reason for our conversation today and the explanation for how this fits in with the theme of my podcast is that it's been over a year now since many of us have been able to travel abroad. But even though we can't, easily hop on planes and visit other countries, technology makes it possible for the world to come to us wherever we are. And of course, when I refer to technology crossing borders, the first thing that comes to mind for most people nowadays is, the internet or a live TV broadcast beamed in by satellite. But way before all that, wireless communication has actually been around for over a century. So to kick off our conversation, let me tell you a little bit about the world's first radio show, if you could call it that. It was broadcast on Christmas Eve of 1906 from a little studio on a beach in a small town south of Boston by this guy named Reginald Fessenden, who was an early radio inventor and pioneer. Wireless broadcasting had actually existed for a few years prior to that. You probably all know the name Marconi, of course. And it was used to communicate with ships out at sea, but they just transmitted Morse code back and forth. But on that evening in 1906, Reginald Fessenden tapped out a message in dots and dashes that said, "Be prepared for something of great interest to follow." And then he turned on his microphone, took out a violin, and played "O Holy Night" before reading a passage from the Bible. And I can't even imagine how incredible that must have been for the radio operators in those ships off the coast to hear music and a human voice over the airwaves for the very first time in human history. It must have seemed like magic. So, now over 100 years later, we all pretty much take radio broadcasts for granted. But if you take a moment to stop and think about it, there is still something that feels pretty magical about how voices, music, and sounds could just kind of come out of the air if you have a receiver that's capable of picking them up. And that's especially the case with shortwave radio, where these distant signals bounce off the ionosphere up in the sky. So if you have a good antenna and the atmospheric conditions are just right, you could actually tune into live broadcasts originating from all the way on the other side of the world. And shortwave radio isn't something that most of us think or hear much about these days now that the internet has kind of taken over the world. The only reason that I know about it is because I interned at a shortwave radio station many years ago, back when I was in college. It was called Radio for Peace International, and it was broadcast from the campus of the United Nations University for Peace in Costa Rica. And it was super cool to, be in front of the microphone to talk on the air and then get emails and postcards from listeners all the way, on the other side of the ocean or wherever. So anyway, shortwave radio has this long and fascinating history, especially in other parts of the world where it's been more popular than it was here in the US. And David's been listening ever since he was a teenager, and he's made some really cool recordings over the years. So I've invited him to share some of his favorites with all of us. And then a bit later on, he's going to talk about one of his other interests, which is documenting pirate radio broadcasts originating from all around Brooklyn, New York, where he lives. So David, thank you for joining us. And why don't you start off by just kind of at the very beginning giving a kind of a real basic explanation of how radio, and particularly shortwave broadcasts, work?
Okay. Well, radio occurs in Earth's electromagnetic spectrum. And this is all electrical energy we're talking about, from gamma and X-rays at the very top of the spectrum to natural light, and then at the bottom down to the short, medium, and long radio waves. And those carry the programs we hear today. Those frequencies are particularly good at distance. 500 megahertz to 1.5 megahertz is what we know as the AM band or medium wave. Shortwave goes from 2 megahertz to 30 megahertz. Above that is VHF, very high frequency. There you'll find like police broadcasts, and above that is FM. So the magic of shortwave I encapsulated in a haiku of all things, and one that rhymes. I don't know if that's allowed, but it goes like this. The short waves go long, skipping off the atmosphere like stones on a pond. So these short wavelengths, they aim up at the sky and they bounce off the ionosphere thousands of miles away. And a lot depends on the sunspots, which govern what parts of the frequencies are active, time of day in other parts of the world. To me, along with the really interesting programming you can hear, it's sort of a way also to tune into the Earth and to see what's going on between the Earth and the sky, because every day things will change.
And you have a clip you wanted to play of kind of the natural sounds?
Yes. So before there was broadcasting, as we know it, there were still broadcasts going on in the Earth's atmosphere, and they can still be heard today. To hear them, you have to be at the very bottom of the radio spectrum, the VLF, very low frequency. And if you are about a mile from any power sources, because it's very quiet, you'll be able to detect these natural occurrences, which are usually signals derived from lightning impulses, electrical impulses from lightning. They have different names: tweaks, spherics, the dawn chorus, whistlers. So I'm going to play an example of whistlers. So this, before anyone had a radio, this is what was going on in the atmosphere. So that's a short example of a whistler.
That's otherworldly, like aliens or something. Actually, I've heard sounds before of the sound of like the aurora borealis or something. Is that kind of a similar sound?
Yes, I'd say so. And the aurora borealis is also interesting to a long-distance radio listener because it's one of the things that will enhance reception. So during an aurora, if you're listening on AM or medium wave, like from where I am in New York City, suddenly I'll get reception of stations I don't normally hear, from Venezuela, even down to Brazil, Colombia. Suddenly the dial may be filled with these stations, and then it may disappear within a few hours. So that always excites radio hobbyists who really want to hear things that are far away, things they may not have heard before.
Very cool. So yeah, you want to talk a little bit about kind of the history of shortwave radio?
Yeah, well, you summed it up very well. Marconi was the big innovator with shortwave, and, to the point where his experiments ended up with a business use. It was used for relaying messages and for commercial activity. So, radio as we know it today, it was really developed from experimentation in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were the hackers of the day. The shortwave frequencies, there was a time where the government in the U.S., they were using broadcast for business uses, and the amateur radio operators, the hackers, they were sort of pushed off because the government thought there really wasn't much going on there. But they innovated and experimented, and they were able to develop that into use for long-distance communication. Basically, what happened in the 20s, the roaring 20s, as you said before, when people heard that violin and they heard voice in 1906, they were blown away. So for years, experimenters, they were making programs too, even before the first official stations were licensed in the early 1920s. So there was already program activity going on. And by the late 20s, there was a real craze for long-distance listening. The New Yorker published a poem called The Distance Fiend. You could search online and find it. It's about a guy who was so crazed that he didn't want to listen to classical music from a local station. He wanted to hear it from 1,000 miles away.
You sent me some guidelines, listening guidelines that the BBC had sent to listeners in the very beginning, because this was this new technology and people didn't know, how do I listen to the radio? What do I do? And do you want me to play this?
Yeah, that would be great. I think it was also in response to complaints where the BBC sort of had a very elevated sense of what they wanted to convey, and people were writing in and not always agreeing with that. So this was in a listener guide in 1932 that the BBC put out. They laid down the law as they saw it.
And we figured it would be best to have someone with a British voice, a British accent read it. So I put this through a British accent generator. So here are the BBC's guidelines for how to listen to the radio back in the day.
Make sure that your set is working properly before you settle down to listen. Choose your programs as carefully as you choose which theatre to go to. It is just as important for you to enjoy yourself at home as at the theatre. Listen as carefully at home as you do in a theatre or concert hall. You can't get the best out of a program if your mind is wandering or if you are playing bridge or reading. Give it your full attention. Try turning out the lights so that your eye is not caught by familiar objects in your room. Your imagination will be twice as vivid. If you only listen with half an ear, you haven't a quarter of a right to criticize. Think of your favorite occupation. Don't you like a change sometimes? Give the wireless a rest now and then.
Wise advice, eh, Scott?
I love that. I love that. If only people listen to the radio like that nowadays. For those of us who are content creators and spend so much time, editing every little detail and everything, if people would just sit in a dark room, turn out the lights, and give their full concentration as opposed to listening while they're doing other things. I thought that was really interesting.
Right, and I think that is a signature strength of shortwave. It's often a solitary crowd of people who I think of as sort of being united in their basements or their attics, listening to these faraway signals all together yet alone at the same time.
So I guess the BBC, given how big the British Empire was back in the day, I guess they were one of the first ones to really get into this.
Yes. So before I get to the BBC use, I'm going to play a short example of a reception by what they call a DXer. And DX is Morse code for distance. So there were aficionados, as I said, who wanted to hear things from far away. This recording surfaced recently, and it's really remarkable. It's from 1933. It's reception of a station in Brooklyn, WBBC, nothing to do with England, but it stands for the Brooklyn Broadcasting Company. And they played actually a lot of ethnic programming, as we called it at the time, and Yiddish programming, really interesting station. This recording is by a listener in England, and he recorded it on an aluminum disc and sent it to the station to verify reception. This was something that at the time stations really wanted to know who was hearing them and where. And the listeners were rewarded usually by getting a postcard or a letter verifying their reception. And they would save these and count how many they had. So here is WBBC in Brooklyn as received in England.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is station WBBC, home station owned and operated by the Brooklyn Broadcasting Corporation. Maintaining offices and studios in WBBC, located at 554.
So you'll hear that it's kind of noisy, and this is something that once you become sort of hooked on these broadcasts, you actually like. It's sort of the noise conveys distance in a way. It sort of helps you slide down the signal to the location where it's coming from. Anyway, those are my romantic notions about it. But as Scott, you were saying earlier, the BBC, they were an early player in using shortwave, and it was important because they had a far-flung empire. And this next sound I'll play is from 1932. It's King George V addressing his empire. And it was at the end of a program that was full of listener greetings that people sent to the BBC, and then they were read out. So people in different parts of the world were greeting each other. And this was really extraordinary at the time.
Through one of the marvels of modern science, I am enabled this Christmas Day to speak to all my peoples throughout the empire. I take it as a good omen that wireless should have reached its present perfection at a time when the empire has been linked in closer union. For it offers us immense possibilities to make that union closer still. I speak now from my home and from my heart to you all. To men and women so cut off by the snows, the desert, or the sea, that only voices out of the air can reach them. To those cut off from fuller life by blindness, sickness, or infirmity, and to those who are celebrating this day with their children and their grandchildren, to all, to each, I wish a happy Christmas. God bless you.
So that speech, which was actually written by Rudyard Kipling, touches on shortwave's great strength, which is to transgress borders. And so shortwave developed during World War II. There were lots of uses, soft diplomacy, stations getting their message out, but also propaganda. In Germany during World War II, they had Lord Haw Haw, who was a British fascist who defected to Germany and would broadcast taunting messages back to England and to the U.S. There was Ezra Pound in Italy, who was given a platform by Mussolini, and he broadcast diatribes against Roosevelt and the Jewish bankers, as he said, who were funding World War II for their own gain. Tokyo Rose, who actually never called herself that, went by Orphan Anne, and she was an American citizen who was trapped in Japan. She went there to care for a relative and was then sort of forced into doing these broadcasts to troops all over the Pacific. And she was deemed a traitor and jailed for several years after the war. She was later pardoned during the Ford administration. But if you listen, I won't play them right now. They're a little hard to listen to fidelity-wise, even compared to some of the things I've been playing. But seek her out online. It will be usually under Tokyo Rose. And she says things that are really kind of tongue-in-cheek. She calls herself her listener's favorite enemy. She introduces a swing song by saying, here's another assault on your morale. So there's a lot of winking going on in a lot of people's opinion about that.
I'd love to get to some more of your clips. I guess the next big era was kind of during the Cold War, how shortwave broadcasts were used then.
Yeah, this is where I came in. I was 13 years old and had been enamored of listening to faraway stations on AM. My sister and I would sort of listen to them and make up stories about them. And one day, visiting my Uncle Lou, who was usually just railing about my long hair or criticizing rock and roll, he gave me an old radio of his that had a shortwave band on it and really didn't know what that was. I asked my dad. He was like, you won't hear anything on that. So I got home, I turned it on, and I heard something sort of like this.
In our country, everyone's opinion is respected, provided it proceeds from an objective analysis of reality.
Now that's Radio Moscow, and that was very typical of the propaganda, that they would aim actually with a special North American service. And that's what most of shortwave broadcasters are comprised of, or were comprised of, nations that wanted to get their message out. So sometimes it was local to their region, but often they had special services that reached other countries. Sometimes in the language of that country, they may have had multiple language services. I'm going to just move on quickly and play a couple more Radio Moscow clips. Here's Radio Moscow on religion.
We consider all religions to be basically reactionary. For be it Mohammedanism, Buddhism, or Christianity, they all preach essentially the same thing. Be patient with life on earth. Accept all and everything. Turn your left cheek to the man who struck you on your right cheek, for he will go to hell and you to the heavenly kingdom. It, that is religion, is against men fighting for their freedom. Religion has always opposed education. Giordano Bruno, Galilei, all of those people were burned at the stake by the Catholics, that is, Christianity.
Hey, well, he has a good point. So this all this stuff blew my mind. I became an expert on the Soviet 5-year plans and the production outputs of coal and manganese. And I'm just going to play one more clip, which is very interesting because it's Radio Moscow's acid take on the civil rights movement, which, our country was in turmoil. And this was Radio Moscow's view of what was going on.
Violent clashes have taken place in Alabama where segregationists, with the connivance of the state authorities, are making brutal attacks on demonstrators. The scenes of bloodshed in Montgomery are reminiscent of the worst examples of savagery. In Montgomery on Saturday, crowds of enraged segregationists made a brutal attack on 21 Negroes and white people protesting against the anti-Negro laws. The streets were a scene of bloodshed. According to eyewitnesses, it was a terrible sight. It is also reported that one Negro was left lying in the streets in a pool of blood. The crimes of Bloody Saturday have the blessing of Governor John Patterson of Alabama. He took no steps to prevent the outrage and gave instructions to the police not to intervene. A characteristic feature of Bloody Saturday in Montgomery was that the racists turned on the reporters, particularly press photographers and cinema operators, who tried to take pictures of the scenes of brutality.
That sounds pretty familiar too. So again, really interesting to hear this perspective of what's going on in our country, which, was suppressed in many ways, as they say. My observation is that basically I realized at that young age that there was a war going on in the atmosphere, and along with the war comes espionage. And I heard these stations too. These are called number stations. And about 21 years ago, I did a piece for the Lost and Found Sound series for NPR, run by the Kitchen Sisters, really worth seeking out. So this is the first minute or so of my report about these mysterious stations that just broadcast numbers.
Atención, 6, 7, 3, 7, 0. Atención, 6, 7, 3.
The first time I heard a Spanish numbers lady, I was a kid, lying in bed, tuning around on my uncle's old shortwave radio.
Atención. 6,
I was baffled by the solitary voice. She's still on the air, and even though I've heard her in one form or another since the early 70s, the sound of her voice continues to haunt me.
7, 0. Atención.
Achtung, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Ever since I was 13, I've scoured the shortwave bands for exotic signals. It's hard not to stumble over a number station. When I first heard them, no one seemed to know anything about them. By the end of the 70s, they acquired a following. A hardcore group of listeners continued to obsessively tape and analyze these stations. They give them catchy nicknames like the Boardman and Bulgarian Betty. Hugh Stegman tracks the numbers for Monitoring Times, a journal for hardcore radio listeners.
They're encrypted messages to somebody. We think it's to spies. We hope it's just to spies. Nothing more sinister than that.
So that's a little bit of that piece. And number stations are still on the air today, not quite in the same way as during the Cold War, but they still exist. They are an unbreakable system. It's basically broadcasting to one person somewhere who has something called a one-time pad, which the spy master also has. And as long as the one-time pads are not captured, the code is unbreakable.
That's so fascinating because we think of broadcasts as something for a mass audience. And this is a case where it's being used for one individual to reach another individual to send them this secret code. It's the opposite of what we think of as, the actual definition of the word broadcast.
That's right.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And that's surprising that this is still in use, maybe to a lesser degree, but that there are still number stations today. You have some more sounds you want to play for us?
Yeah, before we leave this period, this is a shortened piece I did called Mercy, So Much Noise that I made about 10 years ago, which sort of evokes the atmosphere of the 1970s era of listening, using mostly archival sound.
Here is a Swiss chronometer to give you the exact time. At the final turn it will be 13 hours 15, Greenwich Mean Time.
Tananarive, chaîne internationale de Radio Madagascar.
Aquí Radio Andorra, emisora del Principado de Andorra.
You are listening to Radio Andorra, post-text number 1, Principality of Andorra. 300 meters 60 medium waves, 50 meters 04 short waves.
This is Caracol.
This is Yaoundé.
Vous êtes à l'écoute de Radio Voix de l'Évangile, station ECNF, Addis Abeba.
This is our administration of the nation. We broadcast on the 60 and the 90 meter band, 308 meters medium wave and channel 37 FM for the Gatherings area.
see so much noise out here.
So that was what I heard in that time. And for a year, I was really into shortwave. And I finally, unfortunately, broke the radio by tuning at the end of the dial. There just seemed to be like a few more things I could reach, and the dial broke. Had another receiver for a while, but it wasn't really quite the same. It was a ham radio receiver, didn't get all the frequencies. Later, in my early 20s, in my post-college days, I sort of thought, let me check this out again. And I got a radio that had a digital display, which allowed me to use a guidebook and actually more easily identify what I was listening to, because before it was just numbers on a dial. And, there were ways to find out, and you could hear, they would identify themselves much easier with sort of a TV guide-like book. So in that phase, I discovered something I had not heard before, which I quickly became obsessed with. There's a portion of the shortwave bands called the tropical bands, which, as the name implies, carry broadcasts from the tropical regions of the world. And these, for the most part, were not countries trying to get their message out for good or evil. In Africa, they were like the public radio for the nation. And in other parts of the world, they were small commercial stations that were in Peru and Bolivia, that they would be used to play music, but they would be in parts of the world that were not connected to FM, to TV, even to telephones. And these stations would have messages where it would be like, I'm selling a burro, please meet me on the pass, or Juan is sick, please come home. And radio actually still has this telephone function, often in Native American or other indigenous communities. So to hear these, I learned to follow the gray line. The gray line is the terminator between night and darkness, which enhances reception. So I discovered that on the 60-meter band at 1 a.m., African stations, it was morning in Africa, would sign on. And then I'd stay up all night, and at dawn, I'd hear Latin America signing on, as long as this terminator was moving. And then when it got too light in either my location or in the transmitting location, the signals would fade out. So I'm going to play a couple clips now. This is GBC, Ghana Broadcasting Corporation, signing on. And I recorded these next files like in the early to mid 1980s. Oh, actually, that was recorded in 1999, as she said. So this next one, though, is a little short clip from Radio Niger. And I would record things like this for hours. And Radio Mauritania also really had amazing broadcasts like that. Musicians live in the studio, they would play for hours at a time. And so then towards dawn, I would start to hear the Latin American stations. Here's Radio Zarake from Ecuador. I recorded this in 1989.
Esta es Radio Saracay, la estación más querida y popular en el territorio ecuatoriano, transmitiendo todo el tesón de la nacionalidad ecuatoriana, Santo Domingo de los Colorados.
So at that time, it was really media scarcity. We didn't have all the feeds we have online now. So to hear these stations were really an extraordinary feeling. Here's another one I really enjoyed listening to, not on the tropical bands, on a different part called 19 meters, but it came in actually fairly well at that time. This is around 1987. This is Radio Tahiti.
You know, it's so interesting listening to this, David, because nowadays we're used to we have the internet and we could just listen to anything, but all this technology existed in the days before the internet when, you know, people wanted to find out what was going on around the world. I mean, even just to learn, like they'd have to pull out an encyclopedia or go to the library or, you know, but in these days before, people could just go to a website or something, or, you know, they could just tune in the radio and hear these sounds from all these distant, fascinating places that people didn't know much about back, you know, in the previous decades.
Yes, and people, they would have maps of the world on their walls. They would have clocks tuned to Greenwich Mean Time, which was sort of a world-based time. So you would know that this station was coming on at, you know, 2300 or 0600, which corresponded to the time in England, but was used around the world to note time. There were several stations that broadcast the time in various parts of the world, and still do, run usually powered by atomic clocks.
Huh. You have maybe like one more clip before we move on to pirate radio?
Yeah, I'll have one more. This will be from the Middle East, where you'll still hear broadcasts like this. This is from Radio Kuwait, probably recorded about 10, 12 years ago. I don't think they're on the air at the moment, but other stations like Saudi Arabia and Radio Oman will carry programming like this, although not exactly what happens at the end, which is, I think, was peculiar to Radio Kuwait. So Radio Kuwait was actually, they played pop music most of the time, but they would also play the Quran and other religious material.
Mm. Before we move on, so what's the status of shortwave radio today? You'd think it's kind of an old technology with the internet and everything. I guess it's not as widespread as it used to be, but it is still around?
Yeah, the usage has changed. It started changing about 20 years ago, where the BBC announced that they were dropping frequencies on shortwave to North America, which had a big hue and cry at the time for a lot of people who weren't even into the dirty aspects of listening to all the weird stuff. It was like the easiest way for someone in America to hear the BBC, and you could hear it all the time, like around the clock. And they started drawing those frequencies away, and other stations followed suit. So many of the nation-based broadcasters went off the air for good. There are some left. Turkey, China has a huge presence, which is probably not a surprise. It's also used by sort of brokered transmitter sites in different parts of the world where clandestine broadcasters or a rebel group may lease time on these stations outside of their country or the country they're trying to change, and aim programming into it. Like Zimbabwe has a number of outside broadcasters that are targeting Zimbabwe through these shortwave transmitters. And that is shortwave's remaining attribute, is that it crosses borders, where the country, which may not have a free press, and they want to stifle information and dissent, they can just shut down the internet. But someone broadcasting on the other side of the border can get the signal through. And it can serve as a safety net during natural disasters, which happened in Sri Lanka. This great professional radio listener enthusiast, he organized amateur radio operators to help out in the wake of the tsunami that happened several years ago.
Right. Let's move on, I guess, to the second part of what you wanted to talk about. I guess another passion of yours is pirate radio. And you're in Brooklyn, and you actually created a website of all the many kind of pirate radio stations right in your part of New York City there. I guess, first of all, like the term pirate radio, what exactly does it mean, and how widespread is it?
Well, pirate radio has a storied history. It's basically broadcasting without a license, but broadcasting programs and talk shows and content. So in the United States, pirate radio goes back to the Communications Act of 1934, which was addressing interference issues at the time where too many stations were getting on one frequency and, you couldn't hear them. They were interfering with each other. So the Act established the FCC, established the Federal Communications Commissions, which keeps an eye on licensing stations and other communications matters in the U.S. And so you had to have a license to broadcast. So on the other hand, the technology, especially if you had some knowledge, if you were an amateur radio operator, you could get on the air. And people have done this over the past 100 years in various forms. In New York City and also Boston and South Florida, there is a very active scene of pirate radio that is aimed largely towards West Indian audiences. And in a nutshell, it's because the media environment is very tough to assay in the United States. It costs a lot of money to buy a station. Frequencies in major cities are few and far between. And so if you go to pirateradiomap.com, my site, you can read about this. I have a several-part essay called Tracing Neighborhoods in the Sky, and I have an interactive map that I made. There's a button, go to the map, or you could go directly to map.pirateradiomap.com, and I have about 300 clips. There's a tuning interface because, as I've tried to convey, the act of putting your hand on a dial or clicking a button and hearing the station, it's really a special thing. So I constructed this map as a way to experience the richness of all these stations. I hear, where I live in Brooklyn, 25 unlicensed or pirate, because they're pirating, they're commandeering a frequency. And too much to go into now, but there's a famous pirate scene in Britain, Radio Caroline, other stations that were broadcasting offshore because there was a monopoly on radio by the government, by the British Broadcasting Company. So I've been aware of this for a while. I would say the modern activity in Brooklyn goes back to the late 60s, but it was of a different flavor. So I'm going to play a couple clips to show how pirate radio in Brooklyn and the rest of New York City has changed. I would say over the whole city, there may be as many as 100 unlicensed radio stations. So here's a blast of what was happening in the 70s. There's a New York Times article from 1982 that reports on about 12 stations that were regularly on the air. And at that time, they had to be sneaky about it because the FCC was well-funded and they had, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed agents who were trying to catch these stations. So here's a short clip of 3 of the stations that were on the air during the late 70s.
It's new. It's now. It's hot. 91 and a half.
In the dull and commonplace occurrences of day-to-day radio, there's one radio station that will definitely stand out. That's WFRB 87.9 in Brooklyn. Instead of slick, professional, commercial, hypey radio, you'll get bad, distorted, buzzy-sounding, lousy-sounding, muffled, amateur, get-your-ego-off radio. In other words, a completely unique experience.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the World Radio System. This is WKOB Radio.
So, these were very characteristic of the stations at that time. They were sort of kids playing radio, spoofing the broadcast of the day. That last voice was Alan Weiner, who also now runs a very independent and free speech-minded shortwave station, WBCQ. At the time, he jousted mightily with the FCC. One time, his station, which had been on the air in Yonkers 24 hours a day, he was yanked out of bed at 5 in the morning by the FCC while they raided his station and carted everything away. After those early busts in the 70s, he actually operated some legit stations in Maine and later kept thinking, how could he get on the air in New York? And in 1987, he broadcast from 10 miles off of Jones Beach in international waters on a Radio New York International. And I have some clips on my site about that. And after that, the local pirate scene, which had all banded together to join Alan and putting on this broadcast, lasted about 2 days before the Coast Guard boarded and they were handcuffed on the deck for several hours in the sun. So things started to change, and ultimately these kinds of pirates disappeared going more on into the 90s. But you started to hear other pirate radio stations which were broadcasting to a different community and had a different purpose. The stations that I just played followed something called the Johnny Carson rule, where they would wait until Johnny Carson, the talk show, went off the air until they would broadcast, because that way they would know their neighbors would go to bed, the transmitter would not interfere with the TV, they would have less attention. But I heard this station, WBAD, which started to go on the air like in the early evening and stay on till late at night, and I thought, wow, I can't believe they're doing this. Many stations started to follow suit. So here's a short clip from a documentary I made for KCRW's Lost Notes podcast called WBAD Outlaws of the Airwaves.
I learned a lot of things through Dr. X.
All right, more music by DJ Centronic, DJ Dave Centronic on Nasty Radio WJQR with Dr. X. Ugh!
We used to laugh because we used to say he can make a transmitter out of pots and pans. That's how smart he was. You know, he would go to Radio Shack and he would buy all kinds of gadgets and build stuff. And then he got comfortable with me and, you know, he showed me the transmitter, so I was very fascinated with the whole pirate radio. And he taught me some things, and then he sold me the transmitter.
For security reasons, I'm broadcasting from an undisclosed location because the subject of tonight's American expose is terrorism.
It was a really big, clunky transmitter. It was like all tubes. You know, once I bought that, then I put it up in an apartment that I had over here in Windsor Terrace. We put the antenna up, and then I started, and then I decided to call it, you know, since we knew we were doing something that was bad, we decided to call it WBAD Radio.
Yeah, this is badass radio. Yo, what's up, cuz? What's up with those radio stations playing love songs all day long?
Hey, yo, I never knew love like that before. And I don't wanna know love like that no more. I'd rather hear that ill shit that Centronics be playing. We don't play no commercials, so son, what you saying? Bad radio, pirate station, our creation, sponsors and censors, we got no relation. Never break up like Jodeci and Devante, Centronics, Mystic, Carlito, Brigante, Sinister Cause, DOT, Vigilante. If you wanna battle, let's make a bet and up the ante. We could get ill for real and still go to heaven. Bad radio, Sundays 5 to 11.
Sundays 5 to 11. So that's WBAD, and really interesting story behind that. And they were on the air for 3 years until they were taken down by the FCC from 1995 to 1998.
What are the penalties for people who go on the air illegally, like nowadays?
Well, the penalties are quite severe, but the reality is that there are so many stations on the air, and at the time these stations started to pile on in the mid-90s, the FCC went through some big cuts. They used to be very, attentive to going after those earlier stations, and then it became that, they would issue fines, they would issue warnings, and stations would often just come right back on the air the following week. Equipment was pretty cheap, and through the internet was starting to become available, or plans were being made available, and people were sharing information. In the 90s was also sort of a nationwide civil disobedience of pirate radio. So there were broadcasters to immigrant audience or to audiences like WBAD's, African-American audiences who wanted to hear unadulterated hip-hop with, all the profanity intact. They bragged their great advantage over the local commercial station. Lately, it remains a concern of the FCC and also the National Association of Broadcasters, the broadcast lobby. So in the past year, Congress passed and former President Trump signed the Pirate Act, Preventing Interfering Radio Abuse Through Enforcement, one of those charming acronyms they use. And now they have a complaint-driven system. So, for instance, WNYC, I talked to their chief technical officer.
Which, if people don't know, it's the big public radio station in New York City.
Yeah. They have a couple stations, and on their 2 frequencies, they are plagued by at least 6 pirate radio stations that are not right on them, but they're next to them, and so their listeners complain, and these complaints are delivered to the FCC, and the FCC will wade through these complaints. I'm told there are 2 FCC field techs who go out and try to find these stations. Sometimes they just tell them to go off the air, to take the antenna down, but the mechanism that was in place was they find the station through triangulation, a technique to locate the signal. They find the address and they send them a letter and they're saying, hey, we noticed that you're broadcasting on this frequency. If you have a license, please send us a copy if you are legally authorized to use the frequency. Now, the FCC knows they don't, and it always sort of amuses me that they have this language. But now the Pirate Act gets rid of that, and they can go right to the fine. The first one is called the Notice of Unlicensed Operation, and if the station went off the air, then there would be no further penalty. If they continued to broadcast, then they would get the NAL, the Notice of Assessed Liability, which says, you're still on the air, you didn't prove you have a license, so we're fining you, in the old days, $10,000, $15,000. A couple years ago, they started to fine landlords, and they had a big fine of a South Florida Haitian station, $150,000. Now the Pirate Act allows them just to go right to the fine, and the fines are $100,000 a day up to $2 million. I guess after then they say, that's enough. But here's the thing. There's a statute on the books which allows fines from the government to be reduced down to ability to pay. So if you show your tax returns and say, I make $30,000 a year as a home healthcare worker, then your fine is reduced, maybe to $2,000 or $5,000. And for some of these stations who have no other way to get on the air, they can't afford to pay time on a station, which could be $5,000. There are very few spaces to start a new station, so they would have to buy an existing commercial station for maybe like $70 million. So this act has just started to be enforced, and I'm skeptical whether it will really do much. I think what might winnow these scenes away eventually will be gentrification as these neighborhoods dilute. And I talk to pirate radio operators, and they don't really follow the news. I mean, they just continue to operate within the bounds of this gray area that they've established. And so I'll throw in a clip here. This is just a couple minutes of some of the local West Indian pirates that I hear in my neighborhood.
Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?
From a top secret location on a big rock called Planet Earth, this is Royal Radio 94.3 FM.
Yo, man, what you tell them there?
His feet the gal there.
The party is ending at 2 a.m. So whatever you must do it now.
Tommy drop on the mic, make a chant on the dance hall rhythm. Tommy drop on the mic, make a chant on the dance hall.
Let's do the thing properly now, boys.
Tommy drop on the mic, make a chant on the dance. Tommy drop on the mic, make a chant. Tommy drop on the mic.
94.3 Royal Radio, we here, baby, let's go.
What happening is that?
Say what?
Tommy drop on the mic, make a chant on the dance hall rhythm.
Game for the gal them.
Mix it up real nice when me check.
If you are not live, come to the live right now.
You seen a New York City, you seen a New York City, New York.
Them a call us pirates. Them a call us illegal protesters. Just because we play what the people want.
YVR 98.5. Pick up every single bootleg radio station in New York, you know. Hear me I say. Hear me I say no.
Them a call us pirates. Them a call us illegal protesters. Just because we play what the people want.
And like one station, it gonna run New York.
Two stations,
It gonna run Brooklyn.
three stations, it gonna place a nation. Everybody
Massive, me know say New York City, I'm sure them other radio station they not big way up, you know. But we hard clean, yeah.
if them broke down one, we make five
So we know this.
down in
New York, we've got.
lots of radio stations.
What you mean?
Playing the people music night and day. Yeah. Reggae, calypso, hip hop or disco. The latest sound today is what we play.
So, interesting thing about that is a song called Pirate Radio by Shabba Ranks, and it was written about London's very active, similarly themed pirate scene of the 80s and 90s, very influential there. And so the local DJ, when Shabba Ranks says London, he's potting down and saying New York over top. So I thought that was pretty cool.
It's funny listening to like the station IDs and everything. They sound very professional. Like you wouldn't necessarily know if you were just tuning across the dial that this is a pirate station.
That is true. And frankly, I go out on the street and I talk to people. Do you listen to these stations? No, I don't know what you're talking about. And then when I describe them, they're like, yeah, I listen to that, but they don't know it's an illegal station. And some of these stations have commercials, which supposedly the big broadcast lobby is threatened by. They claim that they're being robbed of revenue, but they're for roadie shops, they're for funeral homes, they're for liquor stores. They're for things that you would never hear commercials for this stuff on radio because the economics of commercial radio won't support anything like that.
Local businesses could never afford to advertise on Z100 or some big station in New York. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Especially in a place like New York, a city that size, right?
That's true.
Yeah,
very true.
yeah.
I made a documentary for the BBC called New York City's Pirates of the Air, and I talked to a station under a pseudonym. I call them Radio Activista. They're in a neighborhood on the border between Brooklyn and Queens, struggling in some ways. And before I contacted them, I looked on their website, and they're posing with police officers who love the station because they get people to community meetings, they hand out safety information. It could be that those officers did not know really that it was a pirate radio station, but they loved it. And that's another reason why these stations probably stay on the air, because the FCC, if they're doing a raid, they want to go in with the police, and the police are not really interested from what I hear. This is not a big priority for them to take these stations off the air.
Because in a lot of places, these pirate stations, they're filling like a niche that doesn't already exist on like the airwaves with all the big commercial broadcasters, right? Like they're supporting like local businesses. I mean, it's like community radio, but in an unlicensed way.
Yeah.
I worked when I was going to school up in Boston a number of years ago, and I was kind of volunteering there was a small station. It was called Alston Brighton Free Radio. When I was there, it was kind of legal, but it was under the part of the FCC FCC's rules. It's called Part 15, which governs like garage door openers and TV remote controls. So on a good day, it could be heard from a quarter mile away.
Yes.
It can work somewhat in a dense area like a city, but it's still really hard to get good reception, and that eventually led to its downfall.
Yeah.
But during the best of times, it was a real grassroots local community station where there was a pet show and a gardening show and Al's punk rock show and these, political activist shows and shows in like 5 different languages. And, it was just really incredible and really reflecting the voice of the community. And I mean, that's the reason that many of these stations start, because people aren't finding their own voices and their own interests reflected on the commercial airwaves.
That's exactly right. I think one reason why it persists in these communities is because they're often marginalized economically, and you don't need to be online. You don't need to have an internet connection. You don't need to have a data plan. All you need is a simple radio. And I'm on the edge of a large Haitian community, more than 80,000 people. And right now I could tune through the dial and there will be about 10 Creole language Haitian stations on the air. And a lot of that has to do with their history, because in Haiti, during the Duvalier regime, it was all state radio. There was no free information, with one exception, Radio Haiti Inter, where the director of it was assassinated, essentially. So there was something called the transistor revolution, or the age of transistor, where people would hide their transistor radios under the bed, or as one person told me, they wouldn't buy tobacco. They would save up to buy batteries for the radio so they could hear information coming from off the island, often from the Voice of America, the official broadcast voice of the United States, which provided a freer flow of information for people on the island. So they come here, and the great wave of Haitian immigration started in the 60s. And when they come here, they want to establish a radio station. And for one thing, the people who run them, it makes them a person of some importance in their community. And even if they're not reaching a lot of people, they become hubs for activity.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Okay, well, this has been incredibly fascinating. So thank you all so much for joining us. Is there something we want to go out on?
Actually, let me do this, because I mentioned this earlier. I've been listening to the local pirates a lot and started recording them in 2014. And when COVID came, I started listening and recording almost 24 hours a day. And it was really interesting to see a change. A lot of these stations, they sound sort of commercial. Some are just automated and don't have any announcers. But when COVID hit and the West Indian community was affected very heavily, the stations started to come on the air during the day, when often they would only come on in the evening. And they had very personalized programming directed to people suffering through this time. So I'm going to go out on this. This is a COVID Calypso, and I recorded several from different stations. There were also quarantine streams, as one DJ put it. On one station, they got several local politicians on the air to talk about the lockdown when it was coming in last March. Another DJ played a song called Too Much Dying. 500 people died today. But here's something that I find really moving.
Don't think it's about 19. I'm telling you, this thing is so dread. Thousands of people already dead. So please stay at home and don't go nowhere. And if you're spiritual, I tell you to pray. Because if you start coughing, I'm telling you, the undertaker waiting with his coffin too. So I tell you, please, my people, be wise. Wash your hand, wear your mask, and please sanitize. I'm begging you, please, be careful out there. And hopefully one day this virus will disappear.
As David mentioned, you could check out his interactive audio archive of Brooklyn pirate radio stations at his website, pirateradiomap.com. It's pretty fascinating, so I encourage you to take a look. And you could listen to many more of his shortwave radio air checks at soundcloud.com/shortwaveology. I've linked to both places in the show notes. Thanks to freesounds.org, which supplied the clip of Tuning Through the Radio Dial that I used at the beginning of the episode. You can follow Far From Home on Instagram and Facebook, tweet me at Scott Gurian, or email me at info@farfromhomepodcast.org. There was more of this conversation, including a Q&A with Far From Home listeners that I didn't have space to include in this episode, but if you'd like to participate in future discussions, you should follow me, Scott Gurian, and the Far From Home Club on the Clubhouse app. It's now available for both iPhone and Android users around the world. And if you need an invitation to join, just email me or hit me up on social media, and I'd be glad to help you out.
Men at home, they bored and don't know what to do. All them rum shop closed, all them nightclubs too. No beers to drink when they watch TV. All the Corona beer sell out completely. All them sporting events, they call it off. Organizers believe spectators might cough. No activities. And I tell you what, no cricket because the Chinese eat all the bats. I'm begging you, please, my people, be wise. Wash your hands and please sanitize. I'm begging you, please be careful out there. One day this COVID will disappear.
Hope so.